Hello, everyone. My name is Ida Cutler. I'm a bookseller at Women and Children First. We are one of the last remaining feminist bookstores in the United States. I'm honored to be here tonight to celebrate the release of Cost of Living by Emily Maloney. We begin our virtual events as we begin our events held in the store with a land acknowledgement. Please join me in acknowledging the land on which the bookstore stands is the unceded territory of the Peoria, Potawatomi, and the Miami people. There are over 75,000 Indigenous people living in Illinois, and we strive to recognize and honor Native literature and communities. We encourage you to learn more about land acknowledgements and the rightful owners of the land where you are viewing tonight's event. Going beyond land acknowledgement to the work on the ground, we also encourage folks to research their local Indigenous-led land back organizations. For us in Chicago, we uplift the ongoing work of the American Indian Center of Chicago. Women and Children First is now open for in-store browsing Tuesday through Sunday, 11 to 6 p.m. We also offer curbside pickup, and we ship anywhere in the U.S. All of our upcoming events will continue to be virtual for the time being, and you can check our schedule on our website, womenandchildrenfirst.com/event. The next event we are hosting poet Paul Tran on February 10th at 7 p.m. So be sure to check that out. Now a few housekeeping notes before we get started. If you haven't yet bought the book, you can do so by clicking the Buy the Book button at the bottom of the screen. Be sure to drop your questions for Emily or Eula by clicking the Ask a Question button, and we will get to them at the end of the readings. Now it's my honor to introduce Emily Maloney. Emily Maloney's work has appeared in Glamour, Virginia Quarterly Review, Best American Essays, and the American Journal of Nursing, among others. She worked as a dog groomer, pastry chef, general contractor, tile setter, and catalog model, and has sold her ceramics at art fairs. Maloney has twice been awarded a McDowell Fellowship. She is joined tonight by Eula Biss. Eula Biss is the author of 4 books, most recently Having and Being Had. Her book On Immunity was named one of the 10 best books of 2014 by the New York Times Book Review, and Notes from No Man's Land won the National Book Critics Circle Award for Criticism in 2009. Her work has recently appeared in The Guardian, The Paris Review, Freeman's, The Believer, and The New Yorker. Eula is going to be reading from her own work tonight, and then Emily will read, and then there will be a Q&A at the end. Without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to the people on screen, and I'm going to go away. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much, and thanks so much to Women and Children First for hosting us tonight. I'm just delighted to be celebrating Publication Day with Emily on this terrific book. So important, so bracing, such an interesting collection of essays. You can order it through Women and Children First, and I just heard that there are signed copies available, so you could even get yourself a signed copy. I'm going to warm up the room by reading a little bit from my most recent book, Having and Being Had, which has quite a bit of overlap in its concerns with the cost of living. Actually, I was very jealous of your title, Emily. I was like, that's what I should have called it. But lots of overlapping concerns. But interestingly, when I was going through looking for the material I was going to read tonight, I wanted to find moments where my book was addressing healthcare, which is a much more major theme in your book. And there's very few of those moments. So I feel like it's like that major work is being done in the cost of living. And in my book, when healthcare is brought up, it's almost entirely metaphorical. So I'm going to read from a few of those metaphorical moments and then pass the baton. And so just for context, this book is written in 80-something short titled works. And I'm going to read just 3 of these short titled works. The first one is titled Consumers. A metaphor is all this really is, David Graeber writes. He means consumption, which was once the name for a wasting disease and is now the word anthropologists use for almost everything we do outside of work. Eating, shopping, reading, listening to music. Consume, he notes, is from the Latin consumere, meaning to seize or take over completely. A person might consume food or be consumed by rage. In its earliest usage, consumption always implied destruction. Consumption was the opposite of production in Adam Smith's inquiry into the nature and causes of the wealth of nations. He made this inquiry in 1776, when work was being relocated into factories and lives were newly divided between home and work. We still use the math of that time to subtract what is consumed at home from what is produced at work. In that crude equation, only work that earns money is productive. And as long as there's no third quantity, like reproduction, the equation works out to zero. She ate it, my father told my sister years ago when she wondered what happened to my stereo. This was during my first year in New York, and the money for the stereo was a gift from my father, who had told me that he would pay for my college tuition and nothing else ever. He had 3 more children to send to college. The stereo was an exception, a surprise for my birthday, and I did eat it. I wanted a stereo, but I needed food. Food is destroyed by our consumption, but silverware is not, though the metaphor behind the word suggests that we eat up even our own silverware and dishes too. We should think about how far we want to extend the metaphor, Graeber warns. Yes, we consume fossil fuels in the eat up, devour, waste, spend sense of the word, but we don't consume music. Music becomes part of us, as food does, but it isn't destroyed in the process. What is destroyed when we think of ourselves as consumers, Graeber suggests, is the possibility that we might be doing something productive outside of work. I'm skipping ahead like 200 pages to a section titled Blood. I'm brought, along with 6 other writers, to a house composed entirely of echoing ballrooms. We've been asked to explain to the people gathered here, all of them wealthy, why they should give money to an artist community. We walk through a room with crystal chandeliers and a room with a tapestry into a room full of paintings of water, hung in gilt frames all the way to the ceiling, as in the Louvre. The artist community is a place where artists can work on their art while living temporarily like the wealthy. A groundskeeper tends the lawn and gardens. A housekeeper vacuums the floors and changes the sheets once a week, and a cook makes dinner every night. Over the course of each year, more than 100 artists share an estate that once belonged to one family. In return for appearing at this fundraiser, I will be granted a 3-week stay at this estate, where I will discover how little time it takes to acquire the mindset of entitlement. The first time the housekeeper knocks on my door to change my sheets, I'll feel grateful for the luxury, but the second time, I'll be annoyed by the interruption. At first, I don't understand why we need to explain that artists must have time and space to make their art, and that this costs money. As champagne is passed around, some conversation clarifies this. The people here believe that if artists are successful, then their success should produce all the money they need. And if they aren't successful, then they don't deserve money. This is followed by a dinner in a mansion, which I hear the host describing when I come in the door as modest. Why is gang violence such a problem in Chicago? My dinner companions are wondering as I sit down at the long banquet table. Someone says something about bad families. At the suggestion of my host, I move to the other end of the table, where a man mentions that I might be interested in an essay titled The Tragedy of the Commons. I've just read that essay yesterday, I tell him. He hesitates and then explains it to me. The tragedy, he says, is that everyone will always take as much as they can from the commons. This isn't my sense of the tragedy. The tragedy is that by the time that essay was written, the commons had already been lost, and the regulations that once preserved that once prevented everyone from taking as much as they could from the commons had been forgotten. But the idea that the commons cannot be regulated, I know, is the interpretation of that essay favored by free market capitalists. And that's what has made it so enduring, despite the fact that it was written as an argument for limiting the breeding of the poor and is riddled with inaccuracies and outright falsehoods. Its veracity is less important than its influence, one of my colleagues once said of that essay, meaning the lies we want to believe tell us something about ourselves. I excuse myself to join a group of women gathered by the dessert table. One of them tells me that she invests in medical technology. Investment, I'm reminded, is a line of work for the wealthy. I still have the tragedy of the commons on my mind. I tell her about the work I do in the garden at the elementary school. As I weed and water there, I say, I watch other women coming and going from their volunteer work inside. They do homework with the children who come in early for the free breakfast, and they run a book exchange, and they give talks about art, and they share the work of supporting the school. I'm grateful, I tell her, that these women value work that doesn't pay. Someone has to care. But it still bothers me to see only women doing unpaid work. It reminds me of the word that Ivana translated for me as mandatory volunteer work. Capital, the investor tells me, is something women didn't have until recently. We couldn't even carry our own credit cards until 1974, she reminds me. We didn't amass capital, we didn't understand it, and we didn't learn how to manage it. We didn't have mothers and grandmothers teaching us about capital. But here's the thing, she circles her womb with her hand. We are capital. We are the means of production. I had 3 children, she says. I've been the means of production. Now I want to own the means of production. I pause over this, wondering what it means to own yourself, and wondering if the very idea of owning yourself requires, as she suggests, imagining your body as capital. Now she's saying, you know, money isn't bad. Money isn't the problem. Money is the stuff that flows through the problem. Money is the blood. You can test the blood to find out what the problem is, she says, but the presence of blood alone isn't going to diagnose the problem. As she says this, I look around and see it everywhere. The plush furniture splashed in blood, the catered table sopping with blood, the manicured garden watered with blood. One last bit more, which is almost the end of the book, and this is called Consumption. The sound of a piano playing in the dark woke a guest staying in Emily Dickinson's house. I can improvise better at night, she explained at breakfast. I'm Emily today, deep in her biography, breathing her air. David gave me this book, his copy, and when I saw the title, My Wars Are Laid Away in Books, I thought, yes, mine too. My pencil marks are on the pages now with David's pen. On one page, he's underlined, a creator ex nihilo, and written, out of nothing. John is using a blowtorch to light a fire in our fireplace. Matches take too much time. The blowtorch makes a light roar, the sound of evenly controlled gas exploding into flame as it's released from pressure. When the wood is caught and the flames are high against the brick, he sets the blowtorch on the mantle. It remains there, wrong and at the ready. California is about to catch fire. I'll see it from an airplane that will fuel future wildfires. Newspaper after newspaper will report that a place called Paradise has been destroyed, almost entirely consumed. South of Paradise in Los Angeles, the rich will hire private firefighters to save their homes. The future, long predicted, has arrived. My son will inherit this future, along with this property, paid off in 30 years. I don't know how to end this book, I tell Robin. There's no end, there's no resolution. No, of course there isn't, she says. The only way to end it would be to burn your house down. I laugh until I cough and then I can't stop coughing. I've caught consumption from Emily's biography, I think. Everyone was coming down with consumption back then, and there was no cure. One of her neighbors drowned in her own blood. It was the leading cause of death, consumption. Even now, 1/4 of the world's population is infected. More than 1 million people will die of consumption this year, just not here. Readers put off by Emily Dickinson's class privileges, Alfred Hebeder writes, should not forget that she was far more exposed to pain and disease than most of us. I pause over this. Is he suggesting that our discomfort with wealth, political as it might be, should be eased by remembering that the wealthy also suffer? Or is he reminding us that we, of the presumed middle class, are now living lives more comfortable than hers? Perhaps he just wants us to recall that rich and poor alike died of consumption. Health is a mark of money in our time, when a longer lifespan can be bought. The rich of this country are living to be older and older now, while everyone else is dying younger. Perhaps the starkest measure of the failure of our economic policies, Benjamin Applebaum writes, is that the average American's life expectancy is in decline, as inequalities of wealth have become inequalities of health. Meanwhile, life remains the ultimate privilege, the living lording over the dead. The servant who cooked and cleaned for the Dickinsons for 30 years, Margaret Maher, was paid $3 a week. Emily treated her with affection, but also talked down to her. Emily wasn't democratic, as Habiger puts it, but he won't have her written off. Those who see nothing but class privilege should keep in mind that she was a non-citizen by force of custom and law, that many doors were closed to her, and that she left behind more good, hard work than any of us. Speaking of privilege, David said when he gave me her biography, it's a privilege to spend your life writing. Not a luxury, he clarified, but a privilege. I have no other playmate, she said of her writing. She wrote in secret, stealing time for her work, time not spent skimming the milk in the pantry or kneading bread in the kitchen. A fragment of a late life letter to a man she loved but refused to marry, scissored away from whatever else it might have said, reads, "Don't you know that no is the wildest word we consign to language?" I'm going to stop there with the wildest word and turn it over to Emily and this terrific book. I'm excited to hear what you choose to read from it.
Thank you. Thank you, Eula. Thank you for being here, and thank you to Women and Children First for hosting, and for all of you fabulous people in the chat. It's kind of wild. Apparently Zoom is not dead, or Crowdcast, whatever. We're still doing it. So I'm going to read from probably, it's a little past the middle of the book. I'm going to read from an essay called Soft Restraints. And yeah, I think I'm just going to go for it. Okay. Hold on. The woman blew in on a Thursday, early into second shift. It was late spring. Things had begun to heat up outside and in the ER, a kind of June panic that meant admissions increased as the temperature rose. Spring fever, the nurses called it. I had been working in the ER for a few months by now, where patients flowed through the premises with some degree of repetition and regularity. These were patients who saw us as a kind of checkpoint between here and there, a middle ground. One of the hospitals in the area was great for having a baby. Another had a helipad and seemed to get all the trauma cases. We were the ones with the locked psychiatric ward. She seemed less a person and more a force. In her late 20s, light brown hair, blue eyes, medium build, and when I first saw her, thrashing up and out of the bed as if in seizure. By then, I had some experience dealing with patients, and she seemed no different at first, just louder and harder to understand. When you see someone on the worst day of their life, it is hard to know what to say or do, but you learn because there are so many of them, and they are all having the worst days of their lives. In a sense, most of the ER was about worst days. If they felt better, they would be at their own physician's office, or at home, or buying bags of frozen peas in the grocery store. This was a woman I could see buying frozen peas. I thought of her pink manicured hand dropping the bag into her cart. Maybe her name was Elizabeth. Elizabeth thrashed and cursed. "Don't touch me," she screamed at our charge nurse, Ellie, who was trying to start an IV. The ER was laid out in an oval with a ring of rooms on its perimeter, and the nursing station and the doctor's desks inside. Katya, the other ER tech, and I stood at the edge of the ring, leaning up against the counter that separated the station from the hallway, directly across from room 14. Elizabeth kept kicking and screaming. She wasn't sorry. She didn't care what our charge nurse had to say. She would not submit to a talk screen. Thank you very much. And she was disinterested in voluntarily participating in whatever we had on offer, which in this case involved restraints. So she kicked and screamed some more, while Katya and I watched from the hallway. Katya was practical, even-tempered, career-minded. She was going to go to medical school eventually, once she retook the MCAT and scored well enough to get in. She had been a tech for years. Working as one created an important but temporary space between childhood and the rest of her life. She had lots of experience working with lots of patients, and also had worked at hospitals much scarier than ours. "I don't want to go in there," Katya said, a little under her breath. I had reached this part of my life unexpectedly, hadn't anticipated ever becoming an adult, and yet somehow I was, legally, of age and expected to get along in the world. I had some vague idea of becoming a doctor, too, but that was hard to explain to others at 22 when they found out I had half an English degree and none of the pre-med requirements completed, except as audits or withdrawals on my transcripts. I had tried to enroll in chemistry or biology, but the work of those classes was far beyond the reach of my abilities. The classes were huge amphitheaters of teaching, and if you were late, there were not enough seats, and so you'd have to sit in the hall, which compounded my problem. I tried taking a class at the community college, but that moved too quickly and without the necessary pauses so I could understand what was being said. The labs were full of people who seemed to know intuitively what to do, how to pour the alcohols, to light the Bunsen burner without incident. A flick of the wrist here, some neatly copied equations there, in graph paper notebooks. I kept taking these classes even though I had no hope of passing. It was like this. I liked to pretend I could do it. And becoming an EMT still felt possible, made me feel closer to bodies, science. Being an EMT, or at least an ER tech, offered me a kind of legitimacy. In emergency situations, there are two types of restraints, hard and soft. Hard restraints are the stuff of television, the story of the patient sitting up and biting or striking a resident with an open mouth or a closed fist. It's the part of the show where the attending swears at a patient. They're locked with a key affixed with a magnet to the pyxis at the nursing station. What most people don't realize is that it's soft restraints, white, padded, and Velcroed, that are used most frequently, mostly for patients who are at risk of something happening to them. These are the patients who injure themselves by crawling out of bed or falling, or perhaps they have end-stage dementia and they can't help but pull out their IV to spray blood around the room and spatter the privacy curtain drawn between patients. Patients who fiddle with bandages or who scratch where they shouldn't get soft restraints. For nearly everyone, we give them the benefit of the doubt. Usually we start with soft restraints and then move to hards should the situation warrant. There are rules. With Elizabeth, it seemed we would have to immediately up our game. There had been other patients before Elizabeth that day. I worked mostly on the fast-track side of the emergency department, saw kids with kids, orthopedic injuries, new mothers who needed reassurance that the pediatric Tylenol was correctly dosed, men who had removed fingers in meat slicers, toddlers who had faced brick walls or concrete sidewalks and lost, split open a forehead or scalp, and needed sutures or staples to put everything back together again. Earlier in our shift, a Muslim woman came in with a rash on her face that might have been lupus. It was never lupus, and yet there it was, butterfly stretched across her face, the top of each wing swooping to touch her hijab. Once we stopped laughing in the hallway about how strange it was, our gallows humor, like from an episode of House. Someone went in and informed the patient, who was told to see her primary care physician immediately, and if she didn't have one, that we'd find her one. She insisted that I stay with her whenever our PA, who was male, examined her, and wasn't comfortable with a full exam in any case, so I was the one who took her temperature and blood pressure and touched her. I wanted to feel awful for laughing, but none of us did, not really. We laughed because people kept dying, and if you were not having a heart attack or a stroke or maybe a broken arm or needed sutures, we typically did not know what to do with you. The lupus was so easy, for once, a relief, a diagnosis smacking us in the face. But by then, midway through the afternoon, the woman with lupus had been discharged, and so we waited for the next drama to slide through our doors. I occupied the world of the physically well then, or I thought I did. I had not yet been told my thyroid had stopped working, or that the lithium I was taking had likely hastened its demise. That would come a year later. There was no autoimmune asthma diagnosis then, no concerning liver results, no vomiting every time I got my period, no inflammation markers in my labs, no pain in the mornings that radiated from my joints and muscles and ran down my arms or legs. Elizabeth wasn't assigned to me, but I knew her from before, from prior worst days. She was what we called a frequent flyer, someone who was unable to make sense of the world she lived in, and so she came to us instead, a kind of tent revival in our suburban hospital for healing. She had been previously diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and fibromyalgia and had a history of drug dependence. And some sort of digestive ailment, because everything was and is related to the gut, though few people treated patients with this in mind. Mark, the physician assigned to her, was not one of these types of practitioners. The fact that Elizabeth had fibromyalgia alone meant nobody in the ER was about to take her seriously. It was a made-up diagnosis for us then, a kind of early aughts placeholder for female hysteria. I, too, had a problem with being taken seriously. Not here exactly. Here, I showed up for my shifts on time, learned the give and take of conversation, how to address patients, heard their stories, wrote down what drugs they took, performed EKGs, and drew blood. And my job was time limited. The cost of doing business never lasted longer than a shift. But I was odd. I had difficulty understanding when I should speak and how far away to stand from someone else. When I interviewed for this job, or any job, it was a kind of performance. I made great first impressions, but for those who got to know me, I might let my mask slip and could be intense in a way that some found off-putting. Here was another strangeness. I flapped my hands when excited or nervous, or sometimes out of frustration, but mostly I did not know where to put myself. In a strange way, I believed I understood how Elizabeth's tragedy unfolded day after day. The night I showed up at Mercy Hospital, Iowa City, how I barely remembered the nurse who cared for me, the tech, how the pair forced my arm away from my mouth and administered 2 charcoal lavages. I remembered the second one. I was conscious then. For them, it was another shift, this life-saving work, and for me, it was the last day of something and the first day of something else. Elizabeth stopped for a minute and looked up at Ellie, the charge nurse, who was speaking to her. I had turned away by then. I had other things to do, drawers to stock, patients' drug list to inventory. The man in 6 had just brought in an Altoids tin full of pills and had dumped it on the side table, and I had been tasked with finding out what all these drugs were and what he was taking them for. But Elizabeth in bed 14 wouldn't stop thrashing. This was an act, it seemed. Everything sublimated to the performance. We had been drafted as Elizabeth's audience, and we were here for something stark and unimaginable, something important and fierce. The charge nurse was there to bear witness, or maybe the patient was possessed. Years from now, I will glamorize this situation, this moment. Maybe she's blonde after all, or maybe she's wearing makeup or not. I can't say now. It's hard to know for sure. I want her to know that we all saw her. I was tempted to touch her to see if she was, in fact, real, but the charge nurse wouldn't let me in, not after what happened. She's not your patient, Ellie said, which was fine in some ways and felt untrue in others. She might be my patient, I thought. She might be me. In the X-ray alcove off the main ER, I pulled up films of a woman whose head had grown an orange. It was like that some days. You could find people whose systems had gone completely, wildly awry. The woman had a headache for a week, the worst headache of her life, and once we put her through the CT machine, we saw it, a white ball, a little more than 5 centimeters across, roughly the same size as the small oranges you could get for 75 cents each by the checkout lady in the cafeteria. I found this news thrilling, devastating, how our bodies betrayed us. Someone, definitely not me, probably Mark or the other doc staff that afternoon, would have to tell her. She was in room 12 and would not stop crying. I think this was part of the brain tumor, too, though in truth I had no idea. We had not discussed brain tumors in my EMT class. Mark came in and looked at it. He had problems with patients whose problems could not be immediately solved in the ER. Wow, he said, tracing the orange with his index finger. Yeah, I said. When she came in, everyone had assumed she seemed a little wild, panicky, maybe floridly psychotic. Usually things like this were some kind of conversion disorder, or maybe psychosis. She was categorized in some ways like Elizabeth had been. But the crying felt weird, the headache felt weird. So off she went for a CT. We usually waited for results from the radiologist before taking a look ourselves. Not today. The answer was obvious. I thought she had gone off her lithium, he said, staring at the orange. I am on lithium, I said. It just slipped out. He turned to look at me. It was dim inside the X-ray alcove, so we could read films more easily. The side of his face glowed from the screen of the reader. It felt difficult, suddenly, to make eye contact. Did you eat lunch? He asked. What? Lunch. You're supposed to eat lunch. To metabolize the lithium, especially if you're doing something like working second shift. Are you okay? He looked at me with something like earnestness or maybe pity. I don't know why I said anything. I never said anything. I had said precisely nothing to any of my other coworkers. Sometimes when we went out to drink after work, I'd skip that dose just to be on the safe side, since lithium and alcohol weren't supposed to mix. Here in the ER, I was someone who had learned a certain level of competency. Not respect. Respect was not it. But competency, sure. I could fetch things and get things and pull films up on the X-ray reader. Now all that seemed to evaporate. I'm fine, I said. I'm careful. I was under the care of a very good psychiatrist in Iowa City, I explained. I drove to see her once a month or so. But even this idea, that Julie was very good, felt more and more untrue as time went on. You have to be careful, he said, studying me. Me as competent tech had simply evaporated. Here I was, a possible patient. I knew I had said the wrong thing. But this sort of situation, where we treated medical patients as if they had psychiatric complaints, happened all the time. It had happened to me, to Elizabeth, to this woman with an orange in her head. I'm fine, I repeated. She had had the worst headache of her life, she said, and just for fun, we'd put her through the CT machine. It probably wouldn't yield anything, we told ourselves. They say that now CT scans account for half of the radiation exposure for American patients like this woman, up from about 15% in 1980. It is so much easier to look for the problem with a picture than relying on medical deductive reasoning or stethoscope skills, so this is what happened. It probably wouldn't tell us anything, we were told. But then it did. A tumor, 5.2 centimeters across, a bright white ball the size of an orange. There had been signs. She'd been forgetting words, she explained. Mark didn't think I was weird forever. Maybe I imagined the way our relationship changed. Maybe it didn't change at all. Mostly I worked in the fast-track side of the ER, got competent at splinting broken hands and radii and ulnas, so I didn't see him much. When our paths crossed, his gaze didn't linger. My problems looked like Elizabeth's, stretched far beyond my ability to manage the day-to-day work of living. I had sleep disturbances, failed to make appropriate friendships, lived in a well of loneliness of my own making, routinely fantasized about killing myself, and perhaps strangest of all, had a woman in my head who narrated everything as it happened, someone whose apparent role it was to be a kind of judgy commentator, a lens through which I saw the world. She was certainly not me, but helped me practice what to say before saying it. In any event, I had little control over what she said. Later, I realized she was telling me to write down what to write down, and that I didn't have a mental illness after all. But for a while, this was a hard thing to explain to my psychiatrist, who saw the world in narrow, rigid categories, as if sanity were a tightrope stretched between here and there. I think I'm going to stop there.
Oh, that was wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you. I love the way throughout this book that you slip in and out of the role of patient and medical provider. And, you know, often in the same essay, you're like in this one, you're in both roles. It's really interesting. So folks, I'm taking questions for Emily, or I mean, for anyone you want to ask a question of, but I'm gonna MC them. I see that there's a question. Is there an option to turn on closed captioning? I am.
Crap.
Yeah, sorry, didn't see that soon enough. And I do not know. I'm sorry to say. That would be Women and Children First might be able to answer that. And I will send them a quick little note. In the meantime.
Oh, it says, unfortunately, not with this platform.
Oh, okay.
In the chat, I think.
Yeah, sorry about that. And so other questions, it would be great if you can put them in the ask a question little tab at the bottom of the page. It's easier for me to find them there than in the chat. And I was about to ask you something, Emily, but then a question came in. How did you go about finding what felt like the right authorial distance when writing these essays? Did you ever feel too close or too far? It's an interesting question.
That is an interesting question. No, because there's a woman in my head who narrates everything in this book and everything I write. But in all seriousness, a lot of these pieces started in 2008 when I was working in the ER. And when I was working there, I would write these little scenes because I wanted to remember what happened. I wasn't sure what they were. I hadn't really learned how to essay yet. So I was like still trying to figure that part out. So I knew I could do scenes. So I did the scenes and that made it easier. And then the connective tissue came a lot later. This piece is one of the last pieces I think I wrote in the collection. But the material from some of these little, scenes came much earlier. I think it's like, it's authorial distance or it's narrative distance, right? It's like, I think it's just so important to have that space between your lived experience and being able to sort of make sense of it and try and figure out what you want to say. For me, it takes a really long time. Unfortunately, but I figure if I keep working, maybe I'll generate more.
Emily, can I ask you, because I was just teaching a class about putting together an essay collection, and I'm wondering how much reorganization of this material you did and how you decided what went where in the book, what got what position.
Yeah, so I had an idea of what I thought things should be, and then several people rearranged it, and then I sent it to my editor, and then he put it back in the same order that I had originally put it in, which was both reassuring and like also startling. But I think that a lot of the pieces, there were pieces that we wanted to make sure, it's an essay collection, but I wanted to avoid repetition, which can be really common, I think, in essay collections, as much as possible. And so a lot of sort of deciding where things went was also about trying to figure out, I had some biographical information in the beginning that I needed to sort of lay down in order to get to some of the other pieces. So that way people aren't like, wait, what's going on? How are you here? How have you gotten here? So a lot of it, there's like a lot of, and I think that happens at the very end.
Where there were logistical reasons why you put something.
Yeah, just like in terms of being able to sort of see the story, because it's an essay collection, but if people want to read it as a memoir, I want to give them as many tools as I can to sort of be able to put the blocks together. And so that was a lot of it. I put note cards where I wrote the title of each essay up on the wall. I like to print the book as if it looks like the way it would look if it were a real book, using Word. You just like make the margins different. Because I feel like each line is sort of lineated, even though it's not. It was really hard to go to the layout version, I will say that. Like the first past pages came back and I'm like,
looked wrong.
It was hard to get used to that, because I had done it with a certain number of words per line.
That's interesting.
But that, I think a lot of it is just, I don't know. In grad school, I went to Pitt, and my thesis advisor was Peter Trachtenberg, and he said that an essay collection is like a mixtape. And so that was another way to think about it and talk about it, was like, like what tracks are you laying down and when, and what kind of movement do you want to make from the beginning to the end. So those were all things that I tried to keep in mind.
Yeah, there were some great mixtape surprises, like just the movement from the first essay to the second. When I turned the page and saw the title, I stalked my psychiatrist. I laughed out loud, and it was not where I expected the book to go in that moment. I didn't think that was going to be the next move. Okay, there's a bunch of questions, so I got to start doing my job. Can you talk about why you decided to write this as an essay collection rather than, say, a memoir?
It was a memoir at one point. I wrote it as an essay collection, and then I sent it to my editor, and then I revised it into a memoir, and then that wasn't working. I needed the, that like bird's eye view, whatever, 30,000 foot view that essays can provide. And I felt like memoir felt too close somehow, that I wanted to be able to sort of work with really big ideas and bigger problems beyond my own lived experience. And I knew I needed to access that stuff via the essay collection rather than a memoir.
This question is, how or when did you find your essays transitioning or pointing towards a larger work? And in parentheses, this could apply to Eula as well. So I might chime in.
Yeah. Do you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. I
don't know.
I think I think I like to hide from the idea that a book is emerging for the initial moments of writing it. So I think if I sense that it's turning into a book, I like to suppress that knowledge for a while I just play around, because it doesn't feel like as much as of a play space if I know it's becoming a book. But I think for me, this book is, having and being had, is like 80 something titled works, and I think I had about 20 of them, and gave them to another writer, Sarah Levine, another Evanston writer, actually, to read. And it was her who said, I think this is a book. And that has often happened for me as a writer, that I get partway into something that's a bigger project, but it's somebody else that says it. I think I know it, but I need someone else to say it for it to feel real. But I thought at first that I was just writing a few little, what I was thinking of as prose poems, but then I continued to find that interesting. So it just kept happening. What about you, Emily?
I think in books. So I have there's this, and then there's a book I'm working on now, and then there's like 3 books after that.
Oh,
so
wow.
They're just, I don't know. It's like, once I have a sense of what I'm working on, it's like I can see it in my head, and I turn the pages in my head, and I can read it in my head, and I play with it. And then I once I'm ready, then I start actually writing things down. But a lot of both the work that I'm working on now, and then the project I think that will come after, it takes me a long time to figure out what goes in the right order. But once I get to that place, that's my main problem, is like, I have like major structural issues. But once I can figure that out, I'm like, whatever, like the sentence is cool. I like sentences, and, I shouldn't have to do that additional work of making the book. But I do think in bigger projects. I think I have like an essay version of a book that shows up, and then there's the book itself, which shows up a little bit after that.
That's so interesting.
It's weird.
I think it's great. Here's an interesting question. You both write about your class backgrounds in your bodies of work, and you both deal with subjects that aren't often written about with a class perspective. Do you see this analysis increasing in the mainstream, or is it still an outlier? And I'll just say, Emily, I really appreciated the super complex sketch that you made early in your book. There's like a 2-page sketch of this incredibly complicated class background, right? That from one angle could look rich, and from one angle could look poor. And when I read it, I was like, that's so American. This is like, she's really capturing these weird contradictions of class in this country. So you want to say anything about that aspect of the book?
Yeah, I don't know. I think a lot of that stuff came about because, my editor wanted, he's like, we need stuff. We need like information. We need a way to explain where you're from and your relationship to the world. And so those sections sort of came out of those discussions. And I think that was really, it's helpful in that it sort of grounds the narrative and gives it, an understanding of the history that I inhabit, or whatever, that we all inhabit in the book. But I think that, I don't know, like, I don't think of myself as someone who writes necessarily about class or anything along those lines. It's more like, I don't know. You took workshop from Susan Lohafer, right? Did you ever take Susan's class? Oh my God! So you're in like John's classes and stuff, probably, and whoever. Well, Robin, John came later.
Iowa now. We're talking Iowa.
Sorry. I'm like,
program. Just for audience sake, so they
for
know
audience sake. Sorry, yeah.
No, John DeGatta came
later
in my time.
Yeah,
so
that would have made sense.
Robin Hemley, Patricia Foster, David Hamilton,
of course. But yeah, no. It was, I think, in Susan's class that she said, like, my shtick is like the world according to Emily. It's like, she's like, you have to, this is how you explain yourself to yourself or something like that. So that was, I think, and, you know, whatever it is, whether it's like, you know, social structures or the way I exist in the world or other people's experiences, those are the lenses through which I see it.
Yeah, and it was a little different for me with this book. I set out to write about, I mean, by the time I knew that I was writing a book, I knew that it was a book largely about class, and specifically about the middle class, and even more specifically about the upper middle class, and even more specifically about the contradictions in the upper middle class, and kind of where what we say we value is contradicted by what we actually do value, what we invest in monetarily, or what we make happen. So all of that was, for me, it was the project, and I don't think it's super mainstream. I mean, I'm judging just from the first question that almost everyone asked me in interviews is, how did it feel to write about money openly? It seemed like very exotic to almost everyone who was talking with me. And it's kind of amazing that it's, you know, it still is like, like somewhat in the zone of taboo to even, you know, basic things like saying how much you make, how much your salary is, things like that. But I also was a little caught off guard because of that, a little surprised by how difficult and painful and confusing it was actually to even try to locate myself class-wise. I definitely wasn't where I thought I was. That was for sure. I realized I'd been telling myself some stories. Let me just glance through here, Emily. I know there's a bunch more questions. So I'm always interested to know if writers and other artists are surprised by anything in their completed work. Was there anything that you felt surprised by or was unexpected when you were done writing the book? That's interesting.
Anything I was surprised by? I don't know. I think, I don't know. There's this point when like you're working and everything is terrible and you don't really know where you're going. And, you know, everything just seems sort of disconnected and disjointed. And it's just, I don't know, just like a bad series of writing days or weeks or months or whatever it is, and you're in the thick of things. I did not realize at the time that actually I was much closer to the end than I thought I was. And then but you know, which is great to realize, but if you don't realize it until later, you don't get to reap the benefit of, of having that experience and that revelation, which is really honestly too bad. But that was something that sort of surprised me, is that as I got closer and as it got more complicated and weird and scary and awful, and I had a lot of feelings about it, yeah, that's when I think I was actually pretty close to finishing the book.
There's another question about how you think the pandemic is changing healthcare and changing the issues that you're writing about.
This is a very short answer. It is just bringing to light the fact that the system has been broken for a very, very, very long time. And unfortunately, we're at a point where the system is probably going to break completely, and in many places already has. And we've had that, you know, we've seen that. People dying in hallways, people dying in ER bays. You know, there's not enough staff now with the most recent wave to run equipment or hospitals in a lot of settings. And I think that that is something that, you know, unfortunately, things are just going to continue to be more and more obvious in their in the ways in which they've broken as the pandemic continues.
And I think this might be the last question that we have time for.
Okay.
For both, either of you, which came first in the actual writing process? The big picture ideas or the intimate personal moments? Did you tackle them separately while drafting or all at once? You want to tackle that?
I don't know. What would I, gosh. That's a good question.
I'll answer while you think about it.
Yeah, you answer, and then I can generate a thought or two.
Because this one I actually do know. I think for many of my books, I wouldn't be able to answer that quickly or easily. But in this particular book, Having and Being Had, I had a very particular process, and it was that that the intimate moments came first, and then I spent time with them on the page, trying to figure out what they meant or what they might reveal. So that was the process, is that I was always drawing from moments that had some vibration around them. So I knew the moment meant something. I knew it was on my mind because it revealed something. But I didn't always know, when I brought it to the page, I didn't know what it was revealing or talking about, or what the friction was. Or sometimes I knew where the friction was, but I didn't know specifically what was going on there. So much of the writing of the book was like spending time with these moments and drawing more out of them. But in terms of big picture, I do think it took a while. I had to do that with lots of moments before I saw kind of like, oh, these are the major concerns here. These are the thoughts that are coming.
Yeah. I think like I didn't really learn how to write an essay until 2014. And it was the summer of 2014. And I took a class at the Summer Upstate Writing Workshop at Skidmore College with Phil Lopate, who is really a wild and fabulous and weird person in real life. And you know, had like an endless and sort of inspiring collection of Hawaiian shirts that he wore to class. And if you wanted to play tennis with him before class, he just had to, you know, he brought rackets, but he was good. So you would, you know, have to suffer that way. But his whole thing, I think, you know, this idea that there is space, there's that book to show and to tell. And I think there's that space of like needing a place to explain what it is that you're describing is something that, I don't know, somehow I missed in all the other classes up until that point, in like Patricia's class and David's class and like, you know, Susan's workshop. Like you know, I kept writing these essays, but they were really just collections of scenes. And I couldn't figure out how to like get that big picture understanding until that summer when he was like, these are fine. These are scenes, but like, do you have anything to say about this? And I was like, oh, that's what this is about. That's what I should be doing. So to have that sort of light bulb moment for me, that came at that point. And that was when I realized, oh, I could actually talk about big ideas, because I never thought of myself as like an intellectual type. It was just like, I like to read and I like to write. So that was like what made sense. But in that class, it was, I don't know, somehow revelatory.
That's totally amazing. And I love knowing that there's educational epiphanies out there.
There's like one or two, you know, it's great. It's great.
Rather than, I think for me, it was a slow dawning, but it's great that it can happen as an epiphany. Well, we are pretty much out of time, but I do just want to like say happy publication day and kind of join with everyone who's here to congratulate you on this work, which is just tremendously accomplished. And we're all going to keep talking about it for days and months and years. So, and now that I know that you think in books, I get to be excited about the next one.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for such a wonderful conversation and readings, both of you and everyone for tuning in. Thank you so much. It means a lot that we're able to do this right now. And we'd like to continue to do this with all of your support. So please go to our website and buy this book if you haven't yet, or Eula's books if you haven't bought any of those yet, or just any book you want to read. Thank you all so much. And I hope that you all have a good night.
Thanks so much.
Bye.